She was 29 years old and she had exactly $18 to her name when her husband's brother put her trunk on the porch and told her the house was his now. That was Elias Bramwell's way, soft-spoken, Bible in one hand, deed in the other, smiling the whole time he took everything that had ever belonged to her. She had no children to hold on to her, no father living, no mother to write to. What she had was a carpetbag, a wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and those $18 folded into a handkerchief her husband had given her the week before the fever took him. 3 days later, at a tax auction on the edge of a half-forgotten Nebraska town called Thistledown, she watched grown men laugh as the auctioneer tried to unload a ruin nobody wanted, a windmill, blades broken, boards silvered with rot, sitting alone at the edge of a dry creek like something the world had already buried. She raised her hand and bought it for $9. The men laughed harder. She did not laugh. She had heard, from somewhere in the crowd, that old Thistledown families used to say the windmill kept the town's secrets the way a well keeps water, quiet, deep, and waiting for someone patient enough to draw them up. She did not know yet that what waited sealed in its loft would not only change the shape of her own life, but call a broken town back from the edge of forgetting. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Kasha Wren. If you have ever stood somewhere you loved and watched it be taken from you piece by piece, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We read every word. Kasha Wren had been born in 1859 in a river town in Ohio, the only daughter of a millwright named Ezra Wren, a broad, quiet man who spoke more fluently in the language of gears and grain than he ever did in the language of people. Her earliest memories were not of dolls or ribbons but of the mill her father tended on the Scioto, the low thunder of the wheel turning, the sweet dust of cracked corn hanging gold in the light through the loft window, the particular hush that fell over her father's face when he checked the stones for true. He taught her the way some fathers teach sons, because there was no son, and because he saw in her the same patient hands he had. By the time she was 12 she could dress a millstone, could read the moods of a headrace by the sound it made over the gate, could tell by smell alone whether flour had scorched against the runner stone. Her mother, Ruth, softer and more watchful, taught her other things, how to keep books balanced to the penny, how to barter fairly and firmly, how to look a cheating grain merchant in the eye and not blink first. A mill belongs to a town, her father used to say, wiping his hands on his apron, long before it belongs to the man who built it. He meant it plainly, that a mill was not truly private property in his eyes, not the way a house or a horse was, because everyone's bread depended on it, and a miller who forgot that had already gone rotten inside. Whatever his ledger said. Kasha carried that sentence with her the way other women carried a locket. She married young, at 19, to a gentle traveling wheelwright named Thomas Merrow. No, in fact she kept her father's surname all her days, for Ezra Wren had no son to carry it forward, and she had promised him on his deathbed that the name would not vanish from the world. She married a young man named Silas, who repaired wagon wheels and dreamed of homesteading west, and together they had followed the promise of cheap land out past the Missouri, first to Kansas, and finally, in 1882, to the rolling grass country of Nebraska, where Silas's older brother Elias had already staked a claim near a young settlement called Thistledown. Silas built them a small frame house with his own hands on a corner of that claim, a gift, Elias had said at the time, generous and warm, though Kasha would later understand that generosity offered without paper behind it is not generosity at all but merely a debt waiting to be called. For 6 years she and Silas worked that land together, and though they were never wealthy, they were never poor in the ways that mattered. She kept hens, put up preserves, doctored the neighbor's children when the doctor was 30 miles off, and taught herself, in the empty hours, everything she could remember of her father's trade, sketching gear ratios and hopper designs in the margins of her Bible as though some part of her already knew she would need them again. Silas often teased that she loved millwork more than she loved him, and she always answered that a mill never left dishes in the sink, and he always laughed, because that was the kind of marriage they had, easy, unhurried, built on small honest jokes instead of grand promises, and she believed, in the quiet arrogance of the happy, that it would go on that way for 40 more years. It did not. In the spring of 1888, a fever came through the Platte Valley the way fevers do, indifferent to virtue, and it took Silas in 11 days, leaving Kasha a widow at 28 with a house that was never legally hers and a brother-in-law who had, it turned out, never actually deeded the land to his brother at all, a fact Elias Bramwell had known perfectly well the whole 6 years and had simply never found it convenient to correct. Grief alone might have been bearable. Grief compounded with the slow, deliberate unraveling of every certainty she had was another matter entirely. Elias came to call within a month of the burial, not to grieve with her but to inform her, gently, regretfully, the way a man delivers bad news he has secretly been rehearsing to enjoy, that the claim and house were his by right, that he had let Silas live there out of brotherly kindness, and that he would of course give her time, a generous 2 weeks, to make other arrangements. She fought it the only way a widow with no money and no lawyer could fight anything in that country, which was to say she fought it with words, with appeals to decency, with a long and humiliating afternoon in the county land office poring over records that confirmed, coldly, that Elias was telling the truth about the paper even if he was lying about everything else. The house had never been Silas's. The house had never been going to be hers. She packed what she could carry into one trunk and one carpetbag, sold what she could not carry to a neighbor for less than it was worth, and stood on the porch of the only home she had known in Nebraska while Elias Bramwell told her, not unkindly, that he hoped she would land on her feet, the way a man says a thing he does not expect to be held responsible for. $9, when the bidding stalled and Pruitt looked ready to withdraw the lot altogether. Nobody bid against her. She heard the laughter behind her as she signed the paper, heard someone say loud enough to be sure she'd catch it that the Wren woman had traded her last cent for a pile of kindling, and she did not turn around, because she had already decided, standing there with the deed damp with her own sweat in her hand, that whatever the townsfolk of Thistledown believed about that windmill, she intended to find out the truth of it for herself. She walked out to the mill that same afternoon, before she had even secured a place to sleep, because she could not bear to wait. Up close it was worse and better than it had looked from the auction crowd, worse, because the base timbers were soft with rot in places and one whole wall of the miller's shed had collapsed inward, but better, because the stone foundation beneath it was solid Nebraska limestone, well laid and true, the kind of foundation a serious builder puts down when he means for a thing to last generations. She spent that first evening simply walking the perimeter, running her palm along timber the way her father had taught her, testing for the particular give of true rot against the deceptive softness of old weathering, and by the time the light went copper and long across the prairie she had convinced herself that the bones of the mill, at least, were sound. It was 3 days later, after she had rented a corner of a widow's spare room in town for $1 a week and spent her remaining funds on lamp oil and a used ladder, that she first climbed into the loft. The ladder groaned under her but held. The loft itself was thick with decades of dust and swallow nests, one narrow window at the gable end letting in a blade of dusty light. $9, when the bidding stalled and Pruitt looked ready to withdraw the lot altogether. Nobody bid against her. She heard the laughter behind her as she signed the paper, heard someone say loud enough to be sure she'd catch it that the Wren woman had traded her last cent for a pile of kindling, and she did not turn around, because she had already decided, standing there with the deed damp with her own sweat in her hand, that whatever the townsfolk of Thistledown believed about that windmill, she intended to find out the truth of it for herself. She walked out to the mill that same afternoon, before she had even secured a place to sleep, because she could not bear to wait. Up close it was worse and better than it had looked from the auction crowd, worse, because the base timbers were soft with rot in places and one whole wall of the miller's shed had collapsed inward, but better, because the stone foundation beneath it was solid Nebraska limestone, well laid and true, the kind of foundation a serious builder puts down when he means for a thing to last generations. She spent that first evening simply walking the perimeter, running her palm along timber the way her father had taught her, testing for the particular give of true rot against the deceptive softness of old weathering, and by the time the light went copper and long across the prairie she had convinced herself that the bones of the mill, at least, were sound. It was 3 days later, after she had rented a corner of a widow's spare room in town for $1 a week and spent her remaining funds on lamp oil and a used ladder, that she first climbed into the loft. The ladder groaned under her but held. The loft itself was thick with decades of dust and swallow nests, one narrow window at the gable end letting in a blade of dusty light. And it was in reaching along the underside of that window frame, steadying herself against a sudden bird startled from the eaves, that her hand found a seam in the wood that did not belong to any weathering she recognized. A panel, cut deliberately, fitted so cleverly that only a millwright's trained eye, or a millwright's daughter's trained fingers, would ever have noticed the hairline gap at all. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lamplight with a borrowed chisel, prying with the patience her father had beaten into her over 1,000 small repairs, before the panel finally gave way with a sound like a held breath finally released, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a small iron strongbox, and beside it, a leather-bound ledger so carefully sealed against damp that its pages, when she finally worked the rusted latch free, were still legible after what must have been 30 years in the dark. The ledger's first pages told her nothing she didn't already half expect: grain weights, toll fees, ordinary milling accounts in a careful, upright hand signed at the bottom of each page as J. Thistle, and she understood then, with a small shock, that she was holding the record book of the very man the town had been named for, Josiah Thistle, one of the original 4 families who had settled the creek bottom back in the 1850s. But it was the later pages, dated 1861 and after, that made her sit back on her heels in the dust with her heart going hard against her ribs, because those pages were not accounts at all but something closer to a confession, written, she guessed from the shaking of the hand, very near the end of Josiah Thistle's life. He wrote of the mill not as his own property but as a common trust, that he and the other 3 founding families, the Bramwells, the Coyle family, and the Pruitts, had agreed at the town's founding that the mill and the water rights to Cutbank Creek belonged jointly to all 4 families and, through them, to the whole community that grew up around it, with tolls kept low by shared agreement so that no farmer in a lean year would ever be forced to choose between feeding his family and feeding his stock. He wrote of how, in the year before his death, a younger Bramwell, and here Kasia had to read the name twice to be sure her eyes were not deceiving her out of some bitter wish, but there it was, plain ink on old paper, Josiah Thistle naming one Amos Bramwell, had come to him with a scheme to quietly buy out the water rights from the other 3 families for a pittance, using a forged addendum to the original town compact that would grant the Bramwells sole and exclusive control of the creek and the mill in perpetuity. Josiah Thistle had refused to sign it. He wrote that Amos Bramwell had grown cold and threatening, that strange accidents had begun happening to the mill and to Thistle's cattle, and that fearing for his family's safety more than his own, Josiah had hidden the true original compact, along with what silver he could gather as a hedge for the town's future, a relief fund, he called it, meant for exactly the kind of hard winter that eventually did drive the town center a half-mile east and left the windmill to rot at the edge of everything, forgotten, its true history buried with an old man who had died, the last page suggested, of a fall from his own hayloft that his neighbors had called an accident and that he, in his final entry, plainly did not believe was one at all. She read the confession 3 times before she trusted her own understanding of it. Because grief and hunger together have a way of making a person want to believe whatever story offers the most comfort, and she had learned early in her widowhood to be suspicious of any conclusion that arrived too eagerly. So she made herself slow down. She traced Josiah Thistle's signature against the earlier, steadier entries in the ledger, checking that the same hand had written both the calm accounts of 1858 and the frightened confession of a few years later, noting how the letters grew smaller and more cramped as the pages went on, as though the old man had been trying, even in his fear, to conserve every inch of paper he had left. She found, tucked between 2 pages near the very back, a pressed sprig of creek willow gone the color of old tea, and something about that small, private, sentimental thing, a man who kept a piece of his creek pressed into the record of his own betrayal, undid some of the hardened caution in her and let her believe, finally and fully, that what she was holding was not a forgery or a fever dream but the honest last testimony of a frightened man who had loved his town more than he had loved his own safety. The iron strongbox itself, when she finally worked its stubborn latch loose, held less silver than she had half hoped and half feared, a modest sum, carefully counted and wrapped in oiled cloth, along with a short handwritten list in the same failing hand naming the families Josiah Thistle had meant it to help first should hard winters come, families whose descendants, she would later learn, still farmed within a few miles of where she now stood, still calling Cutbank Creek by the same name. Their grandfathers had, never once suspecting what had been done to their claim on it. Kasia sat in that loft until the lamp burned low, turning the pieces over in her mind the way her father used to turn a worn gear, looking for where the teeth no longer meshed true. Amos Bramwell. She had heard that name before, spoken with a kind of hushed, respectful weight around Thistledown, as the grandfather of the very man who now controlled nearly every grain contract and water lease in the county, a prosperous, well-dressed grain merchant and town alderman named Cornelius Bramwell, who happened also to be Elias Bramwell's uncle and the quiet financial hand behind half the debts that kept struggling homesteaders around Thistledown tied to his mercy. It was Cornelius who set the tolls at the only working mill left in the county, a steam mill he owned outright a mile east of town, tolls that had crept higher every year of the recent hard seasons, tolls that farmers grumbled about over supper and paid anyway because there was nowhere else to grind their grain. It was Cornelius, she would learn in the weeks that followed as she quietly asked careful questions of the widow she lodged with and the storekeepers she bought her nails and lamp oil from, whose family had somehow, sometime in the 1860s, come to hold clear and undisputed legal title not only to their own original claim but to the entire creek-bottom parcel the old windmill stood on, the very parcel the county had just sold to her for $9 careless, apparently believing, as everyone in Thistledown seemed to believe, that the old mill and its scrap of land had reverted to the county rolls as abandoned and unclaimed decades ago, its true ownership tangled and forgotten past caring about. She understood now, sitting with Josiah Thistle's ledger open across her knees, that it had never truly been abandoned at all. It had been hidden, sealed away by a frightened, dying man who trusted a locked loft more than he trusted his neighbor, in the hope that someday, somehow, someone patient enough would find it and finish what he had not lived to finish himself. She did not act rashly, because her father had also taught her that a hasty repair is often worse than no repair at all, and because she understood, with the ledger's account of Josiah Thistle's fall still fresh in her mind, exactly what kind of family she was preparing to stand against. For nearly a month she moved carefully, taking in mending work and, when the widow she lodged with could spare a little flour, teaching herself again the feel of dressing a millstone on two old runner stones she'd found half buried in weeds behind the mill, stones that turned out, once cleaned and true, to still hold a good edge. She wrote, in careful copies, the relevant pages of Josiah Thistle's ledger, and she took those copies quietly to the one man in Thistledown she suspected might still remember enough of the old town's founding to corroborate them, an aging blacksmith named Otis Pruitt, grandson of one of the 4 founding families named in the ledger, a plain-spoken man with a bad hip and a long memory who had spent 40 years listening to his own father grumble, in his cups, about a compact the Bramwells had somehow gotten the better of. Otis Pruitt read those pages twice in his forge's lantern light, set them down, and said only, "I always did wonder why my grandfather never trusted a Bramwell handshake." It was Otis who told her, gently, that she would need more than an old man's ledger and an old man's grandson's memory if she meant to move against Cornelius Bramwell, because Cornelius held the county recorder's favor the way he held most things in Thistledown. Through years of careful, quiet money, and a widow with $9 worth of ruin to her name would be laughed out of the land office before she finished her first sentence unless she came armed with something undeniable. She found her opening not in confrontation but in patience, the same patience her father had drilled into her over 1,000 small repairs. She began, openly and without apology, to rebuild the windmill, hauling salvaged lumber, rehanging a single sail with rope and pulley borrowed from Otis's forge, and grinding, in small batches at first, a little corn for anyone in town willing to bring it to her rather than pay Cornelius Bramwell's rising tolls. Word moved the way word moves in small towns, which is to say quickly and with considerable embellishment, and within weeks a trickle of farmers too poor or too stubborn to keep paying Bramwell's steam mill fees began bringing sacks of corn out to the leaning windmill at the edge of Cutbank Creek, paying Kasia in coin or in kind, a dozen eggs, a length of calico, whatever they could spare, because her tolls were 1/3 of Cornelius's and her flour, ground slow and careful the old way, came out finer and sweeter than his steam-driven grind ever had. Cornelius Bramwell noticed within a month, because Cornelius Bramwell noticed every dollar that moved through Thistledown that was not first passing through his own hands, and he came out to the windmill himself on a gray October afternoon, dressed in a fine wool coat entirely wrong for the work of walking creek-bottom mud, to inform Kasia, with the same soft-spoken menace his nephew Elias had once used on her own porch, That the parcel she believed she'd purchased was in fact Bramwell land, wrongly sold by a careless county clerk. And that he would be filing to have the sale voided within the week. He was not, she noted, entirely wrong to be worried, because a voided sale would have been simple enough for a man of his standing to arrange, had she been standing there with nothing but an old man's word and her own conviction to defend herself. She was not. She let Cornelius Bramwell finish his speech, let him enjoy the sound of his own certainty the way such men always do, and then she told him, quite calmly, that she had recently come into possession of some old Thistle family papers concerning the original town compact of 1856, and that she would of course be happy to bring them before the county recorder and the town council both, alongside sworn testimony from Otis Pruitt regarding his family's original share in the mill and creek rights, so that the matter of true ownership could be settled once and for all, publicly, in the light of day. She watched something behind Cornelius Bramwell's eyes go very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid arithmetic on exactly how much a scandal would cost him against how much a quiet retreat would cost him, and though he left her that afternoon with a final threat about lawyers and a lifted chin that cost him visible effort to maintain, he did not, in the end, ever file to void the sale. What he did instead, in the weeks that followed, was subtler and crueler. He leaned on the storekeepers not to sell her flour sacks or spare rope, leaned on the bank not to extend credit to any farmer known to be grinding at the Wren mill, and let it be quietly known around town that a woman running a mill alone, without a husband or father to vouch for her, was an unnatural sort of business better avoided by respectable families. For a hard stretch that winter it worked well enough to hurt her badly. Orders dried up, the widow she lodged with grew nervous about the whispers reaching her own reputation. And Kasia ground flour some weeks for barely enough to keep herself in lamp oil and cornmeal. There were nights that January when the wind came hard and cold off the plains and rattled the mill's one repaired sail so fiercely she lay awake in her rented room certain she would wake to find the whole structure finally collapsed, and there were mornings she walked out to the creek bottom with her stomach tight from more than hunger, half expecting to find the sail slashed or the mill race fouled with brush, the way Josiah Thistle had once described strange accidents befalling his own cattle. None came, not that winter, though she never fully let herself relax, and she came to understand that Cornelius Bramwell's particular cruelty had always run quieter than his grandfather's, no violence he could be blamed for, only a slow tightening of the town's ordinary kindnesses until a person simply found herself with nowhere left to turn. It was Otis Pruitt, and behind him a slowly growing handful of farmers who had tasted the difference between honest tolls and Bramwell tolls and were not eager to go back, who kept the mill's fire from going entirely cold that winter, bringing her small commissions when they could and, more valuably, standing beside her at the January town council meeting where she finally laid Josiah Thistle's original ledger pages before the full council and half the town crowded into the meeting hall to hear it, Otis Pruitt rising on his bad hip to confirm, in his own plain words, what his father had always half said and never quite dared say outright, that the Bramwells had cheated the founding families out of their rightful share of Cutbank Creek a generation before any of the younger Bramwells now sitting comfortably in that hall had even been born. Cornelius Bramwell did not go quietly, not entirely. He produced his own family's paper, the forged addendum Josiah Thistle had described, aged convincingly enough that a less careful eye might have believed it, and for one long, terrible evening it seemed the matter might simply collapse into one family's word against another's, exactly the outcome Cornelius Bramwell had spent 30 years counting on. But Josiah Thistle, dying and frightened in that same loft 3 decades before, had been more careful than even Kasia first realized, for tucked at the very back of his ledger, beneath the false bottom of the strongbox itself, she found the original signed compact of 1856 in all 4 founding families' own hands, including, damningly, a genuine early Bramwell signature that did not match the shakier, more careful forgery on Cornelius's version at all once the two were laid side by side under lamplight before the whole assembled council. There is a particular silence that falls over a room when a lie finally runs out of road, and Kasia would say afterward that she remembered that silence more clearly than almost anything else in her life. Cornelius Bramwell's face going the color of old ash, Elias Bramwell somewhere near the back of the hall suddenly finding great interest in his own boots, and Otis Pruitt's rough old hand coming to rest, briefly and without a word, on her shoulder. The council could not, in the end, undo 30 years of Bramwell dealings overnight, nor did Kasia ask them to. For she had learned by then, from her father's old sentence turning over and over in her mind, that restoration built on someone else's ruin was no restoration at all, only revenge wearing a nicer coat. What she asked for, when the council turned to her and asked plainly what she wanted, was not Cornelius Bramwell's steam mill, nor his land, nor any punishment beyond the truth being spoken aloud where the whole town could hear it, but only that the original 1856 compact be restored and honored, that Cutbank Creek's water rights belong, as Josiah Thistle had always intended, jointly to the town rather than to any one family, that the tolls at any mill drawing from that creek be set by council vote rather than by private appetite, and that the small trove of silver Josiah Thistle had hidden away 30 years before as a relief fund for hard winters be placed, at last, into the hands of the town's own council, to be used exactly as its old dead keeper had intended, for the farmers and families who needed it most. Cornelius Bramwell, stripped in a single evening of both his forged claim and the quiet fear that had let him hold on to it for so long, found in the months that followed that neighbors who had once smiled and shaken his hand out of necessity no longer troubled themselves to smile at all, that farmers who had once had no choice but his mill now had a choice and exercised it eagerly, and that a man's reputation, once a town has watched it come apart in open council, does not sew itself back together no matter how fine the wool coat he wears to hide the seam. He left Thistledown 2 years later for Omaha, they say, still prosperous by most measures but never again the man whose word alone could bend a town's fate, which was, Kasia had come to believe, a truer and quieter justice than any court could have handed down. And so it is that if you were to travel through that part of Nebraska today, past the wide gaunt-to-seed cattle country where Thistledown once stood proud and small along Cutbank Creek, you would find, should you ask an old-timer for directions, that they would point you not toward any grand landmark but toward a windmill, repaired long ago, its sails turning steady and true, its stones still solid beneath it, and they would tell you, if you had the patience to sit and listen, about a widow named Kasia Wren who arrived in that town with $18 and nothing else in the world, who was laughed at for spending 9 of those dollars on a ruin nobody else wanted, and who found, sealed away in a loft that a frightened dying man had trusted more than his own neighbor, the means to give an entire town back what had quietly been stolen from it a generation before she ever set foot there. She never remarried, though not for lack of asking, content instead to run her mill and keep her father's old sentence framed in cross-stitch above her hearth for the rest of her days. A mill belongs to a town long before it belongs to the man who built it, and to watch, each harvest, as farmers who had once had no choice but to accept whatever toll a cruel man set now brought their corn to her mill freely, paying a fair price for an honest grind, exactly as old Josiah Thistle had always meant it to be. She had been cast out with nothing but $18 and a stubborn, patient heart, and it had turned out, in the end, to be enough, not because the windmill she bought for $9 held a fortune in its loft, though it did, but because she was the one person in that whole laughing crowd willing to believe that something the world had written off as worthless might still be waiting, quietly, patiently, sealed away in the dark, for someone honest enough to come and find it. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Kasia Wren's story tonight. If something in her journey stayed with you, we would love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear it too, and if you have a moment, tell us in the comments about a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off as ruined. We read every story you share with us. Until next time, stay close.